So I'm Marianne Gawain, the president of the League of Women Voters, and I want to put in a plug for one other thing. I'm very excited about our youth outreach that we're doing through our art contest. I'm working with the wonderful committee, Olivia Mandel, Shelley Sweet, and Sandy Hogue. And we have contacted high schools all around the county, um, secured the engagement of, I think it's 7 libraries or 8, as well as the Peace and Justice Center, to display posters from high schoolers on the subject of register and vote. So we're having this contest. We've received the entries. We've received more than 60. They're just beautiful. And you'll be so excited to see these in the library. So we're working very hard we're having some outside jurors. There will be a grand prize winner and many other commended posters. And then we're either reproducing them. Unfortunately, some of the libraries, they'll be in rather small size because this is the constraint of the library displays, and some Monterey will be having the originals. So anyway, it's all around the county. It's very, very exciting. It's really will warm your heart to see what these students have produced as they think about the importance of voting starting March 23rd in libraries.
Vinz Koller has been around politics for a long time. He is a political scientist and sociologist with a consulting firm out of Oakland. It's called Social Policy Research Associates. There's a large team of experts and certified experienced consultants there. They advise and participate in programs through the U.S. Departments of Labor, Department of Education, as well as justice issues, and they're their state counterparts. It's not just national. It's also, it's not just national government. It's also state governments. Over the years, Mr. Koller's also managed numerous political campaigns and voter registration drives. He's been an elector in the presidential elections three different times, 2008, 2016, and 2020. Vinz has studied English and political science at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. That's his native country. I think that's true. Anyway, received his master's degree at local MIS, the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey. And he's very active, and he's the go-to guy for data that I've known for years and years. So, Vinz, it's yours, and let's have a good time.
All right, thank you. Thanks, George, and thanks, Marianne, and to the League for both the work you guys do in spreading democracy and participation of voters, and for being here today. Those of you who are attending, love talking about nothing more than voting and voter participation. So we're going to nerd out a little bit here, if you don't mind. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to talk about both the turnout issues, what gets voters more activated, what makes it more likely that voters actually take that final step. I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between who's eligible to vote and who's actually registered to vote and who actually turns out to vote. So we'll take a little bit of a tour through some of the stats on this. This is my kitchen table on election day, or actually election month. We don't really refer to election day anymore. We sort of all are now familiar with this. And in some ways, this already reflects a major change that all of us have gone through, where most of us now vote, especially in California. This is not true around the country. At the kitchen table, we vote at home, and then we take our ballot, drop it off either in the mail or some other way. And that I'll show you a few stats that show that that's really changed voting behavior quite a bit. And it has actually, this is a little harder to measure. It also has had impact on the results of elections. And as George mentioned, I actually vote because I'm a dual citizen. I vote in 2 countries. I'm going to draw a little bit on comparative experience is because what we do in this country is not universal. There are some things in which the US is a very particular democracy. It has some peculiarities. I this March got to vote in my home country, and the voting there is very different. We actually still write yes and no onto the ballot itself, and then put it in an envelope and send it in. It is a very we have a lot of direct democracy measures that people get asked 4 times a year, sometimes even more often, where they weigh in a sort of direct democracy way. I'm only mentioning this because, as I said, I'm going to come back to some examples of how the US does the registration process, the voting process, that's a little different from many other democracies. And it has some effects, not all of them good, on voting turnout. As I said, one of the big changes that's happened as a result of COVID, although it also was a trend that happened before COVID, is that now, because everyone is mailed a ballot, the behavior changes among voters are significant because of that. So we've seen a turnout increase. This is from 2020. We don't have results from the most recent election, which, as you probably all have read, the turnout is very low. But in general, compared to folks who are voting in person, the turnout increase is on average about 4%. For voters who previously voted in person, it's even higher. So, so overall, the vote by mail has had a very positive effect in voter turnout for a couple of different reasons. Some very common sense. You have more time to vote. You don't perceive to have to vote on a given day. You don't have to ask for the ballot to be sent to you if you want to vote by mail. There are a number of reasons. And then most of all, it also has had some good equity outcomes because, as you can imagine, having one day to vote that is a work day puts a burden on working people who work long days, especially. And so it has disproportionately skewed voter participation without vote by mail. So all of those have been positively affected. The other major shift in California is the implementation of motor voter, which was passed many years ago, more than a decade ago, actually, but it really came into effect in 2018. And in that year, we have some good stats from that year. You know, that added 800,000 voters to the rolls. And since then, the transactions, there's a difference between new voters and transactions. Every month, between 600 and 800,000 transactions happen as a result of motor voter, which means DMV gets notified of an address change. They notify the registrars. You get a card if that's happened to you. And it's not just a registration of new voters, it's every time an address changes that has an effect. And it has certainly increased voter registration. Whether it has increased participation is a different question that is not fully studied yet. There's not that much data on how much it has affected voter participation. Just a few highlights, and I have on sort of where we are. I'm going to go into the county a little bit, and then I'm going to go wide again. This is sort of your breakdown of parties in the county of Monterey. And here's a little bit of what I can call the voter funnel. And we usually just think of who's registered, and usually stats of voter participation are reflected as a percentage of who's registered. But there's another pool, which are the eligible voters, and that's an estimate. We don't know for sure. The estimate that the Department of the registrar, the state registrar gives us is that we have 247,000 eligible voters. Monterey County has about a population of 440,000. So a little more than half of them are eligible. And then registered are 210,000. In a general election, presidential election this fall or 4 years ago, one expects about 80% turnout. And in a primary, kind of a low turnout primary like the one we are still in the vote count, so we don't know exactly what the turnout will be, but we expect about a 30% turnout. Now, who's most likely to vote in a low turnout election? It's older people, it's more informed voters, it's more affluent voters, it's more educated voters. So again, low turnout obviously has a result, has an effect. Just sort of where Monterey County falls, because the largest party in all of these counties is the Democratic Party. I looked at that. Monterey County is number 9 among counties in terms of how democratic it is. It used to be number 5 right after Santa Cruz. And it's not that it has dropped so much. It's others have had more of a shift towards the Democratic Party. So these are all between 50 and 60+% voter registration on one side or the other. And here's some more stats in terms of the makeup in the county. The voter age distribution, it's actually somewhat younger than average in the state. But that's also very, very district specific. So if you look at District 5, it's a much, much older district than, say, District 5 being the Carmel Valley Peninsula, much older district than in the voting population than the Valley or Salinas, for example. So if you broke this down by supervisorial district, it would be very, very skewed in different directions. Gender, we have about 10,000 more female voters in the county than male voters. And we have almost 50-50 white Latino split. And then, so that gives you a little bit of a breakdown. In terms of sort of house types, I always find this interesting. We can run stats on, is this a purely Democratic household? Is it a mixed household? Is it purely Republican household? By national standards, Monterey County is not that polarized. There are more mixed households than is national average. In terms of permanent vote by mail status, that is actually no longer really a relevant stat. It used to be. We used to track this closely. Basically, you could argue everyone is a permanent vote by mail person for the moment anyway, since you don't have to request the mail ballot anymore. The other score that's kind of interesting is how are people returning ballots. So we can actually see who's always late, who's always early, and who's in between. And you may notice when you get mail, folks target the early voters with mail right away. It hits your mailbox with the ballot, ideally. And then they may target you again late because either they actually know you're likely to be late, and that's something that the registrar of voter lets the public know. And the reason that's helpful is campaigns can actually stop mailing to you because they know you've already voted. And so that kind of keeps your mailbox clear, or your text box or whatever, however you receive information. And it also allows them then to target, maybe half the voters that still haven't voted yet. So anyway, this is kind of interesting to know that, we have a little bit of an idea who votes early. That voting behavior changes, as you can imagine. Some people wait till the last minute. They say, well, some late breaking news might change my my vote. I think I've already mentioned that voters. So this is the difference between the voters and the non-voters. The non-voters, I'm referring to are voters who are eligible but not registered and therefore don't vote, but also voters who are registered but don't vote. And it turns out voters in California, as you see, tend to be older, educated, affluent, more white than the general, and more homeowners. And this is also true for the split between who's registered and who's not registered. Voters don't really reflect the diversity. So you saw the breakdown between who's registered and who's not registered. Voter participation skews very much towards who's likely to vote are much more, it's a more white distribution. Especially Latinos are much less likely to participate in voting than white voters, and that again has an effect. And so they're also at the opposite end, and this is even more extreme right now. If you look at the current turnout figures, the tentative turnout figures, you'd see that the skew is almost 10-1 between in the participation of older voters versus younger voters. It's about the same block, and about 10 times more older voters turn out in this current election than younger voters. So it's a huge disparity with an effect. So even though the vast majority were eligible to vote, again, we're going back a little bit. This is Public Policy Institute of California data. And because it displays it so nice, I used their graphics. We don't have really good, well, we have the data, but nobody's really gone through and really analyzed it. But you can see here the difference between who's eligible, who's registered, and who's voted is really vast. And again, the makeup of the people who are not voting and the makeup of the people who are voting is quite different. You can see a little bit the seesaw between elections. This is usually the difference between a presidential year or a non-presidential year. So voter participation goes up. And here, this is one of those rare stats where you see it, the percentage reflected as a percentage of California adults as opposed to registered voters. Again, usually you see stats that are expressed as a percentage of registered voters. It makes it appear as if more people voted, but the reality is, fewer than half, on average, vote of California adults, or of eligible adults, I should say. I think I've already mentioned they tend to be more affluent than non-voters. And here's some interesting stuff about what non-voters, how non-voters could affect outcomes of elections. So non-voters, again, we know that they're generally, on average, poorer. They express more support for government doing more to reduce income inequality. So you can imagine that a ballot measure might the results in the ballot measure might turn out differently if those folks also participate. You can really see something flipping. They are less likely to see the state budget as a big problem, meaning having maybe a tight budget. They don't see that as a big problem. So again, this is PPIC survey results from 2019. And there's quite a bit of a difference between how non-voters see this problem versus how voters see it. Here's a good example. We've had some school bond measures fail this year, this election in this county. It turns out non-voters are more likely to be supportive of a bond measure. So if we got them registered and if we got them activated, that could actually change the outcomes. And some of these ballot measures, measure Proposition 1 right now is still sort of teetering. It's pretty tight in terms of whether it makes it or not. So you can see that could actually flip some proposals, bond measures, or ballot propositions if we had more voters participating. I've mentioned already, Latinos particularly are dramatically underrepresented among likely voters. There's lots of reasons for this that we could go into, including and especially how it cross maps with wealth, with the freedom again to participate based on available time, but also there have been some studies in terms of sort of the sense of shared destiny, or the sense of having a stake, and whether you therefore participate or you don't participate. So that's another lecture for another day. I think here's just more stats that show how age and affluence affects the turnout. Now, we have another source of data. I mentioned the Registrar of Voters and the Secretary of State as a data source for this question of how many unregistered but eligible voters are in California. There's a data source through the Political Data Inc., which runs a data service for campaigns that has started to track this. And they estimate that in Monterey County, we have more than 50, close to 60,000 unregistered voters. And they actually have a way to give us an idea who these people are. So we're not just talking about this in the abstract. We actually have an idea of who people are who are eligible but not registered. It's not an exact science, but it's better than just sort of going out and putting out a booth somewhere and asking people, hey, do you want to register? So here's some stats in terms of sort of age distribution. What you see in the column on the left is the count of voters, and then the column on the right is the count of households. So what often happens is that you have a household with registered voters, but there's another person in that household that we believe is eligible, but is not registered. So that's a common occurrence. So you may just have one more person that might have been a child that aged and became an adult. It could have been some other family member that just isn't registered in that same family, but in all likelihood is eligible. And you can see the largest unregistered age group is 65 and older. And then you just see the brackets of age, sort of see. I mean, but it is actually skewed towards older people in this instance. And the gender disparity is not that great. It tracks the difference in terms of the general voting population, but there's also there's more an estimate of more female unregistered voters than male unregistered voters. We can actually, using the same data base, we could actually target households directly where such unregistered voters live. This is a map of Salinas, or parts of Salinas, that shows where, kind of by neighborhood, and you can zoom in and you could actually get right down to the house. Say here, we think there's an unregistered voter. And what that has done, and George asked me to get somewhat specific about how a voter registration drive could be done. What that means is you can actually, these days, go door to door, and you can go to a door where you have a pretty high degree of expectation that there's someone who probably is eligible. I've done this when I didn't know whether somebody was there who was eligible, and you just literally go door to door, and usually you ask, is there anyone in this household who hasn't been registered? Can we help you? And that sort of thing. Here, the question would probably be the same, but you actually have you can basically go target it to those doors. The way campaigns currently go door to door to try to identify supporters, or once they have identified a supporter, they go back and make sure that person has voted. So that's an option for a voter registration campaign. And you could then target it specifically into areas that are less registered. And we know in Monterey County, if you ran the maps, you would show that the highest pool of unregistered but eligible voters are in Salinas and in the Salinas Valley. By order of magnitude, there's I would say 60%, maybe even 70% of all voters, potential voters, are in that corridor. So one could specifically figure out a campaign that looked at that. And I can tell you from experience, about, I would say 10 years ago, there was a voter registration campaign that was targeting exactly those areas. They didn't have these tools at the time. Those didn't exist or weren't as advanced. And so they had to basically go blindly door to door. But they registered 20,000 new voters for Monterey County, and 20,000 is a pretty large group. That's 10% of the voting population in just one voter drive. It was a paid voter drive, so there's a big difference between whether you pay people to do this or you're just relying on volunteers. Just the impact. They did this for weeks. They just went out in the morning. They spent all day going door to door, and that was the effect. So I would say if you were to try to do this, one way to do it would be to run a little pilot and see how many households that you are expecting to have unregistered voters actually do. And you could sort of come up with a metric. After you did a grid out of 500 households, we netted 100 registrations. That's a pretty good hit. So this is a good way to go. If you find it's not as surefire a way to get there, then maybe you retune before you do a larger drive. So that would be one method to do this at scale. And you mentioned that you had a youth program already with this art contest. I just reached out to a colleague of mine who's been working on youth leadership activities in South County, and they have a summit in May with youth who have been very active. They have youth councils, youth city councils. They try to get youth engaged in their city. And if the league was interested in trying to make connections, I'd be happy to make the introductions, because they are very much into the civic participation writ large. And obviously voting is a big part of that. The sense of, and I've done a lot of youth work, and obviously the difference between whether you believe this community is yours to shape, and you're as much of a eligible citizen participant in shaping that community as are the people that you perceive to be running things. That changes a young person's behavior over time, makes them more likely to participate in the future civically. And so that was the mission with those youth councils in South County. So again, if you're interested in finding a way to link your activities with that youth council, with those youth councils, happy to see if there's a nexus between the two efforts. So I'm going to stop there now. I know I threw a lot of data at you, a lot of stats, a lot of graphs, but happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
Can you respond a little bit to just the reception that you seem to get from just blindly knocking on doors, that even though you have data on the residents there, just the interaction at the door level about trying to get access? Because it seems to me more and more people just do not want to answer their door, or they're very short in some interaction at the door. Do you have any experience or suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I think the experience obviously varies greatly. I would find, I mean, and I'll have to say that all of the ones that I'm referring to were pre-pandemic, so I think behavior has shifted a little bit, pre and post. Um, my experience when I did this was overwhelmingly positive, in that people were excited that somebody was actually caring enough to go visit them. And I have to say, I did this. One example was a community. This was not in California. That was in New Mexico, for the Obama campaign, and it was a fairly remote community that barely had running water, and so we were registering voters that again had never been by any government entity, members of which 4 were citizens and 3 were not. And so anyway, here in the county, this drive that was done 10 years ago, I think it varied, and I think overall the response had been surprisingly positive, and you just move on pretty quickly when it isn't. You don't want to bother anybody. So it's more positive than one might expect. But I have to say, we have not done this since the pandemic, so I'm not quite sure what the result would be today.
Can I expand the question a little bit to door to door versus in shopping centers, or where there might be people already gathered? Of course, you don't have no idea anything about their demographics, pattern or anything. You're just taking a chance where the people are. So could you compare just those type of efforts, the difference?
I mean, having both sat at tables and gone door to door, I would say door to door. If you want to have a very significant impact, door to door is the way to go. The tabling is good, but it doesn't. I mean, it's usually in the dozens. And with motor voter, a lot of those get caught nowadays. They didn't used to. So people would register because they had moved, they forgot, they didn't want to go anywhere, they didn't go to post office to re-register or wherever they would have gone. And so we catch those at the table. But nowadays, many of those re-registrations get caught by the DMV. So if you really want to have an impact, you almost have to go door to door.
Okay, that's distinction is worth noting. The demographic charts that you have, how are they available? Who's eligible to get them? Are they pricey? What can you tell us?
Yeah, actually, so the ones that came from the Public Policy Institute, I'll put in the chat the link to that report, because or maybe I'll have to do it follow up, because I can't. Well, actually, I could stop sharing. We don't need to look at my screen at this point. So I will put in the chat the link to the Public Policy Institute's report. The PDI data, you have to have a subscription for the service. And I honestly don't know yet. I've asked them what a nonprofit cost would be. We usually have had access through, as a party, access to the data. So I don't know what it would be for a nonprofit. But it would be in the hundreds of dollars on a monthly basis, most likely. And again, if you do a drive like this, that's, I think, a very important and worthwhile investment.
The question of partnering, for instance, with this youth council connection, it seems to me, I mean, from our standpoint, this is not something we do in a large scale. We do it a lot of individuals may do it. It's not necessarily organized every election, but sometimes there's more interest than others. And I think this coming election may be even more significant in some worlds than not in others. But how do we break in? But my point would be partnering with some existing organizations and neighborhoods that would help us kind of break the ice in that community because we would be newcomers kind of.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree. I mean, I think the thing that was appealing to me with the notion of actually empowering young people in a community to take on a project like that, um, obviously it makes a huge difference. It's very hard to turn away a teenager coming to your door and ask, and hopefully being from the same cultural group, speaking the same language, if language is an issue. So all of that plays a role. Whereas when we were in this New Mexico community as gringos, coming in, we were definitely the outsiders. It turned out to be fine because there was a level of excitement that somebody actually took an interest, but that's not the preferred model, I would say. But yeah, I would say by all means, the partnership sounds like a great opportunity. And those places, those community groups or nonprofits often don't have the resources.
Let me just ask those that are on the screen or attending online, if you have any other questions or offshoots or comments or whatever, maybe just raise your hand somehow and we'll get and have it more personal than me trying to read through the chat. So Ann McDowell.
Some of you know I teach citizenship. I started 40 years ago and I haven't stopped. Right now, the turnaround time is amazingly fast. In fact, it's the fastest it's ever been since I've been teaching. I had a student applied January 29th online. She's going March 14th to her interview. So I told this County Weekly, a flurry of new citizens, and that's usually in PG, it's like 10 or 12 people I help over a whole year. Now it's like between January 1 and now it will probably be close to 10 people already becoming citizens who can register to vote. So, and I speak Spanish, so I'd be happy as a league person also to go into neighborhoods. But wherever we go, it'd be really nice to have, I'll make a flyer that we can have available about citizenship, where the classes are.
I appreciate that, and very much your comment. I mean, I went through a citizenship ceremony myself, and at the citizenship ceremony, when I became a citizen, I had a voter registration card, and the judge who swore us in had us complete the card as we sat there in the San Jose Civic Auditorium. It was a very moving process to do that. And I got the sense that these new voters actually were going to become active voters. So appreciate that very much. One thing I want to mention, Sharon asked the question in the chat about nonpartisan versus partisan registration drives. I would say registration drives almost by definition are nonpartisan or should be. So I say that as somebody who's known to be partisan in my work, but I will say that when you go to a door or even when you register somebody, you obviously register them no matter what party they want to register for. And so I would say, I mean, clearly for the league, I would imagine you'd want to organize, get in touch with programs and nonprofits that are not partisan, which I think is the case for most nonprofit organizations anyway, and just avoid doing this overtly in a partisan way. But I think what you will find is those that are not registered are basically have the same distribution in terms of their actual behavior as those who are registered. So we find that, by the way, to be true for people who decline to state their party preference, that they vote essentially the same way on average as the rest of the population. So, 50% generally vote with Democrats, about 20% with Republicans, and the rest sort of a mix. So I think you can absolutely do this in a nonpartisan way. And in fact, almost by definition, it is probably a nonpartisan effort anyway, because you're going to end up registering people of all parties anyway, even if you ran a partisan drive. I see some questions about Spanish language. That certainly is a big factor. I would say the election department does a great job with outreach and with everything being available, not just in Spanish, but in a lot of different languages. But as a voter registration drive, because our non-participation skews heavily Latino, including non-native speakers, Spanish native speakers, you'd want to make sure that that drive would be staffed with bilingual volunteers who go door to door. Again, another reason to participate, to work with local groups.
I want to ask a little question about turnout as opposed to the registration piece of it. Do you have any general perceptions about why we the United States does so poorly? And I'm not sure if it's going uphill or downhill, or is it flat in terms of just what that data looks like. But I'm always disappointed in what the count is at the end of any election. It seems awfully low to me. Always.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some really great studies. There are those who are not turning out because they're happy and they basically say everything's fine, I don't care, do what you want. There are those who don't turn out because they don't feel like they have a franchise, they don't feel connected, and they think. There are those who don't turn out because they are afraid of making a mistake, and they're thinking, somebody's going to come and get them if they don't do it right. I will also say, I mean, again, this is one of those differences that the U.S. has to almost all other democracies, sort of in the Western world at least, and that is you actually put people through a registration process. So that in other countries you're already part of a database that covers other things as well, the taxes and all those other things. So in my case, in Switzerland, I don't have to register. I'm already a registered voter by virtue of the fact that I am a citizen in that country. So they know who I am and where I am, and they'll mail me the voting materials. So the registration process, that extra hurdle that we put people through, obviously is an extra step that, if you go into the history, there's an intentionality behind that to say, well, we don't want everybody to vote. We only want those people to vote that we, know how to register. So there is a step there that was put there intentionally. And I would say we've come as close as we can without kind of universal registration through motor voter, because it does capture a lot of people, but we're not there yet. So that's one big difference. I will say voter turnout in Western democracies is not better in other countries as a general rule. In my hometown, we get fined if we don't vote. We actually get a $5 fine. One of the few places, even in my home country, where that's the case. And it turns out, voters have repeatedly approved and reapproved that measure. They want to be fined, and it does dramatically change voting behavior. Those 5 francs, turn a typical 50% voter participation into a 75% voter participation. So, little things like that. I don't think a fine is going to, they're not going to pass that with a ballot measure in California, I don't think, but, stranger things have happened.
Do you have any data to show California versus some other states? Where do we stand in terms of just our population participating the way we're talking?
Well, one thing that I was going to say, you talked about polarization at the beginning about another presentation. We are really headed for a future of 2 Americas in all sorts of ways, right? I mean, you name many topics. Reproductive rights, other things, we are headed into a place where some states have one set of rules and other states have another set of rules. And voter participation is another one of those. In California, clearly, the legislature, the governors in the last few cycles have pushed for more inclusive enfranchisement of voters. So that means getting them registered is easier, having more relaxed rules about this whole participation by mail, accepting ballots after, on election day, and having same day registration. All of those are steps that have been taken to give the franchise to more citizens. In other states, just the opposite has happened. The hurdles have gone up. And so I don't have the stats, but there are out there and available where you can really see, in other states how participation is under threat, usually under the guise of voting security, but we are really headed in a bifurcated world where some states really work on enfranchisement and others on what I would characterize as disenfranchisement. Other people have other words for that, but yeah.
Reaching out for other, yes, go ahead, Dennis.
George, see, Howard Fossler had a question about if Vinz has any opinion on at-large versus district elections for small political entities like cities.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I will say that I was quite aware of the going to district elections in Salinas. And I will say, Salinas had been a city that was probably already majority Latino, but had never elected a Latino into the city council until they were kind of forced by court to go to district elections. And that's probably the most dramatic example where I don't know where we would be today if Salinas hadn't been forced into district elections to ensure that communities could elect someone of their choice and not basically be drowned out by the average of the whole community. So I think there are some ways in which political scientists look at this and say, if you have a certain disparity of distribution of voters within a whatever the jurisdiction is, whether it's a city or a district, then district elections are a way to ensure that every community has a chance to elect someone of their choice. And in those cases, it makes a lot of sense. It creates other types of problems. Usually they're of lesser significance than the problem that you're trying to solve, which is this enfranchisement, again, being able to vote in someone of your choice. And if you get to very small units, then it gets more and more difficult to just field candidates, right? So that all has to be weighed. And I couldn't say as a blanket rule from a political science perspective, which is better. But there are certainly examples, numerous examples, where only through district elections was it possible to ensure that enfranchisement happened and that communities were able to elect someone of their choice.
Marianne?
Yep. I was wondering if you could go a little bit deeper on the slide you showed us, where you said that what to me seemed like a surprising number of older voters in our county weren't registered. And do you think that has to do with, peninsula voters potential voters who've moved here and so it's moving for retirement, or is it Salinas Valley voters who maybe were naturalized as citizens some time ago and never registered? I was just surprised because I think in our league, we take it a little bit for granted and are much less worried about older people.
Yeah, I think, honestly, I actually don't know the answer to the question. I was a little surprised myself that the unregistered voters are so heavily skewed towards older voters. And I can only hypothesize that what ends up happening is that we that in a number of households where, especially multi-generational households, it is often the older person that ends up not being registered. They might be an immigrant, but that alone does not quite explain the numbers here. So we'd have to really look at this more closely and look at who are these people, even where are they, in which district do they live. If it just is a reflection of, so the parallel reflection of the distribution in general, in other words, we see that for every household where there's an eligible voter, or for every household there's a registered voter, there might be one more voter who's eligible but not registered. Then we might just have to say, okay, this is just a matter of we have to go target those households. Because again, as a whole, voter participation among older people is higher than among younger people, as we've noted numerous times. So I really don't know exactly why that is. And as far as Monterey County, nobody's really looked at this closely. This is data that we've only had access to for about a year. So I don't think anybody has looked at this closely, certainly not for voter registration drive, but not even for any kind of academic review.
Do you have any comments about a nonpartisan messages that are motivating to people in getting them either to register or to participate? Can you make any generalizations?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways, voter participation is probably, again, I see it sort of as a highly nonpartisan idea, which is you want to be able to have, in fact, even when I worded partisan messaging to Democrats, in my case, I would word them as, your voice matters, right? You want to be heard, and everybody wants to be heard. I've never heard anybody who says, I don't want to influence my community. So I think those messages work. And I would say the positive about partisanship is that in some cases, those contests that are fierce contests, they actually drive turnout. So we may think of them as negative because they can be ugly and nasty in some ways, but to the extent that they actually drive turnout, they actually have a positive effect because they bring more people to the polls. And so in some ways, that's not something for the league to worry about. Let the parties duke it out, or the candidates duke it out. But that's also why certainly in this past election, the turnout has been very low in most places because that contests weren't really fierce. But in some counties, the turnout was very, very high because there was a fierce contest. But I think messaging just for the participation itself and for registration, I think it's all about having your voice be heard. And I would say, nationally, certainly celebrities have helped with that because, if Taylor Swift says voting is cool, that has a different effect than some sociology professor saying it, right? So I'm not cutting any commercials, but I really think that is key, is finding the way to communicate to the community. And especially if you were to do this drive in the Valley, you'd have to talk to the community there about what makes them want to participate and how do we turn them on.
Thank you.
Do you have Vince data at your fingertips about some of the cities in South County, the Hispanic population in general, where the numbers are uniquely noticeable somehow? Or would King City and Soledad and Greenfield, would they all be similarly data?
Quite similar, yeah. I mean, there are some demographic differences between those cities, but for the most part, the Latino population has grown tremendously to the extent where, in some cases, they're in the 80s and 90% of voting population, and so the non-voting population you expect to be in the same neighborhood, maybe even more skewed. So again, the potential is great to register people there, and the voter activation messaging would have to go along with it, because just registering alone does not actually turn a voter into an active voter. You have to do both. But if you register them, then you know who they are and you can reach them again next time an election rolls around. So obviously timing now, if you were to do something in the short run, would be very good before the presidential election, because that raises awareness anyway. Naturally, you don't have to do much for that. And it does turn people out, even if maybe California doesn't matter that much, right? I mean, if you look at the presidential election, it still raises the turnout quite dramatically.
Thank you for that. The floor is still open for questions. We'll maybe head for a couple more if we have them, but
Bev Krebs, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
I was listening to the radio this morning. There was a lady talking about how President Biden wanted to have a lot of people come into the country because they would be taken from the states like Texas, I guess, or Arizona, whatever, and then registered to vote in other places, and they would vote for him. Well, obviously, this lady had listened to some conspiracy theory, because I think any story like that would be hitting the newspapers pretty fast. But how can we deal with the kind of conspiracy theories that seem to be okay for people, or everyone feels it's okay for them to say such things?
Well, I'm not the expert on that, and I would say to some extent you fight bad information with good information, but we're also in a place where we have universes where people get information kind of segregated. Very hard to fight that, except again with good information. I would say one maybe related to that, to the question by Howard about the information level of voters. Purely as a political scientist, I will say this: the average voter participation is your best insurance policy, right? More voters on average make better decisions than fewer voters. That's just a fact. Even poorly informed voters on average make better decisions than more informed voters. You can look at the stock market, and there's some studies on this that say basically you can't beat the market. Some people think more information helps you, while the fact is the average beats you almost all the time. So democracy is actually built on the fact that more people on average make better decisions. So and there is definitely an orchestrated attempt to discredit the democracy and spread these conspiracy theories in an effort to try to turn people off. And then those who are left can run things, however they choose, right? So cynicism and sort of getting everyone into believing, oh, it's all, it's all made up by some people over in Washington, D.C. That's all part of that trend. And I would say the best insurance, and the league obviously is leading in this, is get more people out there, get more people participating, because again, on average, common sense will prevail. I know I've probably gone way beyond time, so
not
maybe
necessarily.
Dennis.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
We're getting close. That's all right. Dennis.
Maybe this will be the last question, because it's about voting in Switzerland. The first time I went to Switzerland, and I was told about how we complain about the number of propositions on our ballot, that the Swiss can vote up to 4 times a year on direct democracy measures. And and having had to organize our polling places, I said, "Oh, so do you have public employees who staff these?" And they said no, citizens. And I said, "Well, how can you possibly recruit people 4 times a year to staff polling places?" And they said, "You're picked at random and told to show up to work." And when I heard that, I emailed our registrar of voters saying, "We have our solution to recruiting enough
It's like jury duty, yes.
like jury duties." But is that true?
I was not aware that they get picked, honestly. I've seen some volunteers. I just voted in person a year ago, which I rarely do because I'm not there usually when these votes happen. They do happen frequently. And one of the big benefits of doing it this way, and by the way, little known fact, the California propositions, as much as you may dislike them, are actually a copy of the Swiss model. It came via Oregon to the US. So Oregon was the first state to adopt ballot propositions in the US, and then California copied the Oregon model. And they are essentially very similar to the Swiss model, although in Switzerland, again, it gets practiced a lot more often. It has some benefits because it does check the legislature, and it tells the legislature every once in a while, "Hey, you go not so fast," or "a little faster, please." It is another way to have voters participate. And again, California is unusual in how often it happens. It's harder to do with a state the size of California just because of how expensive it is. And so there's a whole other lecture on money and politics that could be had about that. But I think that would exceed.
Well, fantastic. This has been a very meaty conversation and lots to think about, inspiring and challenging for us.